With me right now, my first guest of the new year is Tia Mitchell. My goodness me, it's really an honor to have her on. Tia Mitchell is the Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She does a lot of reporting, a lot of it on Georgia, and very important things going on in that state. I want to wish a happy new year and a 2021 welcome to Tia Mitchell. Tia, welcome and happy new year to you.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you too.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for being here as well, Tia. My goodness me, Georgia, what a hotbed of politics and interest. Obviously, so much going on. We've seen what's gone on with the revelations regarding the guy that's leaving the White House in roughly, 16 days or so, and the Secretary of State in Georgia, with the tapes that have come out. And that's a conversation we could have forever. But we need to talk about these two runoff races in Georgia. First of all, I'd love to ask you about the voter enthusiasm. What are you seeing in Georgia with voters right now as we get to the very big elections tomorrow?
Well, I think in some ways, voter enthusiasm in Georgia has become like voter fatigue because they've been so inundated with advertisements, mailers, text messages, phone calls, social media posts. And so a lot of Georgia voters are just ready for this election to be over so they can kind of get their personal space back in a way, and because a lot of voters voted early, unfortunately or fortunately, the ads haven't ceased, the mailers haven't ceased. So even people who cast their ballot, days or weeks ago are still being inundated. So, I think voters are, especially on the Democratic side, they're energized and they are engaged and they do want to win both Senate seats, but they're also just it's been a long slog. It's been nonstop in Georgia for months on end because, as you know, we went straight from the general election to the runoffs. So voters are just ready to get it over with. On the Republican side, I would say it's a little bit mixed. It's the same wanting to get it over with and the same enthusiasm to an extent, because you also have a lot of Republican voters who believe Donald Trump when he says that the election was rigged for Joe Biden and that the state officials have not done a good job in the election and that possibly your ballots won't be counted. So that is definitely a narrative on the Republican side that is also affecting kind of how this runoff is being perceived.
Wow. That was going to ask you about, you already anticipated something I was going to ask you. You mentioned the Republicans and, of course, some of the disarray with some of the supporters and voters who were at this really strange rally. A lot of these things are strange these days. When Perdue and Leffler were at this rally and people were shouting out, supporting, for Trump. And Perdue tried to get a word in and he literally only had a few seconds to do that. How much of that carries on, do you think, into tomorrow?
So President Trump, today's Monday, President Trump is actually coming to Georgia today for a rally in Dalton, Georgia, which is Northwest Georgia, a very conservative part of the state. And I expect that to carry on at the rally, and that energy continues to, affect Republican voters and could affect Republican voters tomorrow during the election. The big question mark is what is turnout, particularly in the conservative pockets of Northwest Georgia and Northeast Georgia, where right now turnout is down a little bit. So the question is, do they ramp back up on election day? We know it can happen. We know that, the current trend is that Republican voters like voting on election day because there's been so much criticism of absentee balloting. But if President Trump shows up today and, we don't know what he might say. If he says, you know what, Leffler and Perdue, you haven't done enough for me. I don't care if you show up tomorrow. That could affect turnout. Now, if he comes out more forcefully and says, no, you got to show up tomorrow. We need you. I don't care. We don't like the folks who are counting. We don't trust them, but still show up, still go vote. That can help boost turnout. The concern for a lot of Republicans is if Donald Trump almost tries to do both, and that the message becomes so muddy, nothing's clear. And then that leaves, voters kind of on their own to kind of decide which one they want to believe. But that message from Donald Trump is going to be really important today because we know it's going to drive the conversation into Election Day, and nobody knows what he's going to say tonight.
We shall indeed see what will happen there with that, Tia. So we've talked about the voters and the atmosphere and the mindset that you seem to be observing, what you're observing and seeing. And you've written a number of things. Most recently, I think yesterday you had a column about Georgia, the swearing in and the 4 Georgia representatives and things like that. That people should read, and I will link to it in the liner notes of this episode, and also your social media information as well, which you can definitely mention as well at the end of our conversation here. But now I want to talk to you and ask you about the shape of these 2 races in particular. The first one I'd like you to shed some light on for the listeners and viewers is the race between Kelly Leffler and Reverend Raphael Warnock. Can you talk about the shape of that race as you see it now with less than 24 hours to go till the polls open?
Yeah, so that race has been, it's different for a lot of reasons, mainly because both Kelly Leffler and Reverend Warnock are first-time candidates. Kelly Leffler is an incumbent because she was appointed, but she's never run for office before. And of course, Reverend Warnock, although he's been a high-profile preacher at a very high-profile church, and he's been involved in social justice issues, he's never run for office before. So as a result, both of them are trying to, have spent this election trying to introduce themselves to voters and kind of appeal to their base in a way that they think will go over the best. So for Kelly Leffler, it's been trying to convince Republican voters that she is a Trump supporter, that they should send her to Washington to protect his legacy, and to kind of convince people that she is a true conservative, because that's been the question when she was first appointed, that she was not conservative enough. And then on Reverend Warnock's side, he's been trying to convince voters that he's not the crazy radical liberal that some conservatives have tried to paint him as. He's gone so far as to have ads where he's walking a dog and cuddling his puppy, and, very much so trying to make sure that he avoids being painted as the angry Black man and the angry, being painted as another Jeremiah Wright. And so as that has kind of shaped that race, Kelly Leffler, every time she talks about Reverend Warnock, says radical liberal or radical leftist Reverend Raphael Warnock. She repeats it so often it's almost become a meme, because again, that's what has shown that can turn off even moderate voters and definitely conservatives, and get them to want to make sure that the Republicans win these races, because they're concerned that Democrats will control the Senate and be able to push the country leftward. So that's really been the shape of the race. Both have crisscrossed the state. Both have been very high profile, which is a little bit different than the other contests.
And I think the last time you were on here with me, I may have asked, to what extent do you think the financial scandal, the insider trading, I know that she was investigated and the charges were dropped, or there were no charges issued, rather. To what extent does any of that cloud the race for her, Kelly Leffler?
So the stock trading, which she was never accused, she was never charged with wrongdoing by the Securities Commission, the Federal Elections Commission, and the Senate Ethics Committee. None of them have thus far said that she's done anything wrong. And so she says she was cleared. We don't say she was cleared. We just say that she was never accused of wrongdoing. It's hard to be cleared if you were never accused of anything by these organizations. But that has been an attack line from the Democrats. And I think, again, the whole focus of these contests is turnout. And I do think that Democrats who are appealing to, regular folks, so to speak, who don't have a net worth of $500 million, that's billion with a B, like Kelly Leffler, then that does resonate that she, has this active stock portfolio. And even during the coronavirus pandemic, there were trades made on her behalf that stood to enrich her in ways that could have been affected by what she knew about the pandemic. So I do think that resonates with people. The other attack line that Democrats have used against Kelly Leffler is that she has been photographed with a man who has ties to the Ku Klux Klan and white nationalist movements. Now, from what we know, it was just, they take a lot of pictures at these events. There's a photo line at any event, Democrats and Republicans, and they're not necessarily doing background checks on every single person who takes a picture with them. So Kelly Leffler says it was just a supporter who posed for a picture. It's not that she knew who he was or condones who he is. But, you had John Ossoff go on Fox News Live and say Kelly Leffler campaigns with members of the Ku Klux Klan. And that was some hyperbole and an exaggeration. But I do think it resonated with some voters who say, Kelly Leffler, maybe you should be more vigilant. And maybe you should, once you learned who this guy was, maybe you should have condemned him and not just said, well, I take pictures with a lot of people. And so, again, for those who are already inclined not to want to support Kelly Leffler, both the picture with the white nationalists and the stock trading scandal gives them more of a reason to not support her.
And from what I'm learning, there was more than one picture and more than one person. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that.
I think so. It was the same person in a couple of pictures, but there were also, for example, during the general election when Kelly Leffler was campaigning with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who we know is a QAnon supporter, and they had militia members show up at some of their campaign events. And those militia members were not necessarily embraced, but again, there are pictures of, those militia members at Leffler campaign events. So again, in the totality, Democrats have said, even if you didn't know some of these folks were going to show up, once they did, maybe you should have spoken more strongly against them. And again, they've also said, she campaigned willingly with Marjorie Taylor Greene, knowing many of the problematic things that Marjorie Taylor Greene has said about people of color, about Muslims, and again, spreading QAnon conspiracy theories.
And of course, for those who may not be aware, Marjorie Taylor Greene was sworn in to the 117th Congress on Sunday, wearing a mask that said Trump won, and furthermore, had pulled down that mask. I was watching it myself on C-SPAN on several occasions, pulling down the mask and speaking, which is against the House rules, as people may or may not know. I appreciate what you're saying, Tia, about the race that we've just spoken about. Let's go now to the second race here, the one, of course, between David Perdue and John Ossoff. And if am I pronouncing his name right? I always seem to get his last name wrong.
Ossoff is correct. Yes.
Okay, Ossoff, terrific.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk a bit about the shape of that race as well, please?
Yes, so that race is different for several reasons. Number one, the Leffler and Warnock race is a special election to finish the term of Senator Johnny Isakson, who retired early with about halfway through a 6-year term because he was getting elderly and had some health challenges. Whereas the Ossoff Perdue race is for a full 6-year term. For that reason, right now, that seat is empty because Perdue's term ended on Sunday around noon, and there won't be a new member until this runoff race is counted and a winner is certified and sworn in. The election itself has been different because, again, Perdue is a first-term senator. He is more familiar to Georgia voters because he ran statewide 6 years ago, and he's been out and about as a senator for the last 6 years. Jon Ossoff is also familiar to Georgia voters because he ran for Congress in 2017 in a very high-profile special election that garnered national attention. And so even though it was a congressional race in suburban Atlanta, you know, folks across the nation knew the name Ossoff at the time. And so for them, it's been less about introducing themselves to voters and more about they've really gone on the attack against each other. And Perdue, I think, in an attempt to avoid confrontation with Ossoff and to avoid those attacks from Ossoff, has kept a much lower profile. He has not done many media interviews. He does not generally speak to the AJC, my newspaper. He prefers to go on conservative media outlets like Fox News or speak to, you know, smaller publications in smaller towns around Georgia. Perdue does not generally announce his campaign schedule in advance. He'll show up in small towns and we won't find out about it until they tell us after the fact where he was. And so that's very different than Kelly Leffler, who does, you know, let us know and wants the media to come because, again, she's trying to introduce herself to voters. Jon Ossoff, even though he is known and has run for office before, he's very young. He's in his mid-30s and, you know, relatively young for, speaking of a U.S. senator, he's young. But he's a very good public speaker. And so he has been known for like these zingers, you know, he just happened to be caught. Fox News showed up at a campaign event and put him on the air live, and he used it to his advantage to really attack Perdue and Leffler in very sharp words that were, again, aired live on Fox News. And so Senator Perdue has refused to debate Jon Ossoff during the runoff, for example. And right now, he's not even on the campaign trail. He is quarantining. We learned right around New Year's Eve, I think, that he had been exposed to the coronavirus through a staffer who tested positive. And so as a result, he decided to quarantine, even though it was the final days of the campaign. And we don't even know if he's going to show up tonight for the big rally with President Trump. Because again, he says, you know, he was exposed, but that also conveniently gave him an excuse to, you know, not have to campaign with President Trump. And it gave him an excuse not to have to go to Washington to take some votes that could have angered President Trump that the Senate took on New Year's Day. So that dynamic's been a lot different in that race.
Remarkable. And it's so interesting because I believe also, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, Tia, that Kelly Leffler also had a situation with coronavirus, test negative and test positive. And I don't even remember how that all resolved itself. What happened there?
Yeah, that was around Christmas time that Kelly Leffler had, you know, a rapid test that was inconclusive. Then it was positive. Then another rapid test was negative. So she took a couple of days off the campaign trail, but she didn't take much time off because, again, she said eventually the test came back negative, 2 consecutive negative tests. And she said she was in the clear.
I see. And then a couple other quick things. One of them, you talked about Kelly Leffler and posing with Klansmen and whatnot. David Perdue, I mean, what he did with the elongating the nose or enlarging the nose of Jon Ossoff, who's Jewish, the things he said about now or soon to be Vice President Kamala Harris. Has he apologized for any of those things, David Perdue?
No, and there was a recent controversy over the weekend because there's a photo that was posted in October, but it didn't make the rounds until this weekend of David Perdue holding up a 3-finger symbol that has been used as a symbol of white supremacy. And that Democrats began circulating the picture and saying, look at David Perdue holding up this white supremacist symbol. The person who posted the picture back in October said, this was about David Perdue posing with teenagers who were election volunteers who were celebrating knocking on 3,000 doors, and that there was nothing wrong with it, that the person who posted it was actually Black, and that the 2 teenagers in the picture were people of color, they said. So again, there's no evidence that David Perdue was purposely posing, using a symbol of white supremacy. But there are still a lot of questions about, why would he hold his fingers that way? And was he perhaps duped and didn't know that that's what that could have been interpreted as? But one consistent in all of these controversies is he has not apologized, because he says he's done nothing wrong. The ad around Ossoff, Ossoff complained about it, but Perdue's team just kind of shrugged it off. When it came to mocking Kamala Harris's name, that became a much bigger controversy because, again, it's almost as if David Perdue was almost catering to a base by mocking Harris because he actually pronounced her name correctly to begin with, and then he almost muddied it. It came across as if he flubbed it on purpose to kind of mock her. And so that was a big source of criticism, but he just kind of shook it off and kept it moving. And again, he's been quarantining, but his campaign has said, look, you got the explanation from the Black guy who posted this picture. There was nothing wrong and it's much ado about nothing. And again, like we spoke about Leffler, these controversies don't necessarily do anything to affect Perdue with his core constituency. But if you were already, inclined not to support him, then these probably do add more fuel to the fire.
I really do appreciate your time. I mean, goodness gracious me, we could go on for a few more minutes about all of this. David Perdue, a lot of privilege there, all of those kinds of things, Sonny Perdue and all of this, the trades for him too, and all of the fact that he's traded more than any other member of Congress. We can go on and on, but for now, we'll leave it right there. I've had the distinguished pleasure of speaking to Tia Mitchell, the Washington correspondent of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's also at the NABJ. Can you tell us quickly what your title is at the NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists?
Yes, I'm chair of the political task force. So the whole goal is to get more Black journalists covering politics and to help increase the pipeline of Black journalists who are interested in being political reporters.
Terrific. That is really great. And I will put links up to that organization too, and your social media. If you want to give out your social media, now's the time to do it, please.
Yes, I'm at Tia Reports on both Facebook and Twitter. So that's TIAREPORTS at Tia Reports. Follow me. I love to engage with folks.
Wonderful. Tia Mitchell, your analysis and your reporting is absolutely stellar. It's such an honor to have you on. So thank you so very much for being on this edition of the Politicrat Daily Podcast. Happy New Year to you, the first guest of the year. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.